We're going to do our lecture on finances and policy, and this is one of the last lectures we have for the semester. I saved the policy stuff for the end. But what we're going to look at here is how do we generate revenue in the state of Texas, and how do local governments in the state make policy about how that revenue is spent. So when we talk about revenue, it's the income the state uses to provide the services we've come to expect from government, pay for all types of programs, etc. And for almost every country in the world and every city and state, this is taxes. None of us like paying taxes, but tax revenue is essential to running the state, to running the country, and every country in the world pretty much collects taxes. And so we demand a lot of our government, but we don't like paying taxes to pay for all of that. So here in Texas especially, we do not have a state income tax. So most of the revenue our state is able to raise comes from the property tax and the sales tax. We'll talk about the sales tax first. So the sales tax is 6.25%, and then local governments can add an additional 2%, which all of them do, which makes the sales tax rate that we pay in the state of Texas 8.25%. So that 6.25% will go to the state to pay for state level things, and the local governments will keep that 2% to pay for local services. And, this can go for things such as transit, like bus systems, trains, all that kind of stuff. Economic development, annexing more land, developing the city to make it nicer, to attract business. And one that's really popular here in North Texas is creating new venues. Like we've got the new ballpark that's been built in Arlington, and we've got the new Dickies Arena in Fort Worth. And so tax revenue is allocated to build these types of things because the belief is that investing in those types of things will bring more business to the city, which in turn will lead to increased revenue. So sales tax makes up about 25% of the total revenue the state brings in each year. Now, the sales tax is what we call a regressive tax. And what that means is the burden for sales tax is much heavier on people with a lower income. So, with the exception of food and a few other things, we pay a sales tax on everything that we buy. But, if you are someone who's making $250,000 a year, 8.25% sales tax doesn't really hurt you that badly. But if you are a family of four making it on, say, $40,000 a year or $30,000 a year, then 8.25% of all of the money you spend to buy things that you need is a much heavier burden. And so, as of a couple of years ago, I think this was current as of like 2018 or so, the poor and the working class pay about 12% of their total income to the sales tax, whereas the wealthy, it's only about 3% of their total income. So the sales tax is definitely a much heavier burden on those in the low income bracket and in the middle income bracket. And it can be unreliable. So something that we're living with right now, with the exception of groceries, people can't go out and just spend money the way that we're used to. So in times like this and what's coming after this, we know for sure that we are probably facing some tough economic situations after the quarantine is over. Sales tax, it's tough to depend on sales tax because people may not be spending as much because they're going to have to save for those necessities, things like utility bills and daycare and all that kind of stuff. And so when people don't have as much extra money coming in, they don't tend to spend as much money. And then the property tax is what we refer to as an ad valorem tax. And so what that means is that your tax rate goes up as the value of the property goes up. So if you have a $100,000 home, your property taxes are not as high as someone with a $500,000 home. It just makes sense. So the local governments are the ones who assess the property taxes, set their own rates and things like that, and collect the property taxes and give the state their portion and keep their portion for themselves. And property taxes go to fund our schools, fund improving our utility systems, paying our fire department, our police, paying for libraries, parks, any of those types of services. Um, so the amount collected in property taxes has continued to go up significantly for probably the past 30 to 40 years. So in 1994, Texas collected 15 billion in property taxes. In 2013, that had jumped to 45 billion. And this is one of the things that really conservative politicians in the state have been fighting at the state level. Some people want to put caps on the percentage of property taxes that local governments can assess. I think what was being discussed by the lieutenant governor was somewhere around 2%. The problem with capping those is if you set a hard line cap like 2%, but that amount of money is not satisfying the needs of local government or the school district, it ties their hands because they can't raise that percentage anymore, and there's really nowhere else for them to make up that revenue. So essentially, the government services that we've come to expect, the quality and availability will start to suffer. Now, for property taxes, there are a few exemptions that the states have put into place to benefit certain groups of people. So one is the homestead exemption. So if you own a house, the first $25,000 of value of your home will receive no taxation. So if you have a $100,000 home, you're only going to pay taxes on $75,000. And then residents over 65 can add another 10,000 to that. And the reason being is because back in the 80s and 90s, you would see these stories all the time in the news about, really old people, on fixed incomes losing their homes because they couldn't afford their taxes. And so this is one way the government has come up with here in our state to try and ease the burden of taxes on the elderly who are living on retirement and who are living on fixed incomes and things like that. And then another 3,000 can be added to that for people who are have a disability. So you can get a possible exemption of up to about $38,000 on the value of your home. Now, if you look at this chart over here on the right, this shows the big pie here shows you where the state's revenue comes from. And so you can see the biggest percentage is right here, 47%, and that is that is property taxes. So property taxes make up the bulk of revenue here in the state of Texas, and that's because we don't have a state income tax. We're a very conservative state. We don't like the idea of an income tax. So property taxes have to pick up the slack. The 25% here, this is our state sales tax, so that's 6.25%. And then the local sales tax, that extra 2% is 7%. And then other state taxes, this can be a lot of different things from hunting, fishing licenses, our fees that we pay to renew our vehicle registration, all that kind of stuff goes in this category. But if you take that property tax percentage and you break it down to who gets what from that 47%, you see school districts get the biggest percentage of that money, with, let's see, 8% going to the cities, 8% going to the county, and then 6% going to special districts like airports or other things that we've talked about throughout the semester. So like we said, the property taxes are appraised at the local and county level. Some of you own homes, so you are familiar with this already, but some of you will own homes in the future, and we all want that, so this is something to be aware of. And again, it's why I talk a lot about in this class how important local level politics are. Because all of this type of stuff, the taxes you pay, your school districts, all of that is handled at the local level. So property taxes are appraised at the local level and county level, but you can protest them if you believe they have overestimated your tax burden and asked to have it reviewed and things like that. Um, so most of our local government revenue property tax accounts for about 37% of that. And what we mean by the real value of property. So if you buy a home, if you, let's say, the market is down and you buy a home that's worth $200,000, but it's not a good housing market, so you were able to get that house for $150,000. Well, one thing you have to think about when you're buying a home is you're not paying taxes on what you paid for the house. You're paying taxes on what the house is valued at. So even though you got the purchase for a really good deal, your tax rate is going to be based on the value of the home. So if you overpaid for your house, you'll make up some money in having taxes below what you paid. But if you underpaid, the taxes are going to be higher than you may expect. And this tends to get people in trouble when they buy more house than they can afford. Texas has a statewide guide for appraisal. It requires that municipalities have to adopt these practices so that the assessment of taxes is kind of the same across the state. But it does not require that the person who owns the home has to disclose the sale price of the house. So if you overpaid for your house, that benefits you because you don't have to report that you overpaid for your house. Right now, in our small cities, our ones that are, less than 5,000 people, the tax rate is about $1.50 per $100 of assessed value of the house. When you come to bigger cities, like Dallas, Fort Worth, and places like that, it can be $2.50 to $3 per $100 of value of the home. So, if you live in a big city, you're going to have higher property taxes. If you live here in Fort Worth or Dallas or somewhere like that, there's certain neighborhoods that are just insanely expensive because of the tax rate in those neighborhoods. So that's something to think about, as you get older and start thinking about buying a home and things like that. Some other taxes that we assess. So in that category of other taxes, things like franchise taxes. So businesses pay about 0.5 to 1% of their revenue to the state for operating a business in the state. But we have very low business taxes compared to other states, which is why a lot of companies have moved to Texas because they don't have to pay as high a rate here as they would in, say, like California or Colorado or New York or somewhere like that. As of about 2015, business taxes only account for about 9% of the total revenue. The argument here on behalf of our kind of conservative government is that if we keep those taxes low, it will attract more business to the state and therefore will create more jobs for citizens. So sometimes, businesses will get these very attractive packages to bring their headquarters here where they may not have to pay any business taxes for X amount of years because they're creating infrastructure, they're creating jobs and things like that. So it's just a particular, more kind of conservative philosophy about business taxes that we have here in the state. Oil and gas tax account for about 5.6% of revenue as of 2015. Now, it'll be interesting to see, this year, if y'all have been watching the news, the value of a barrel of oil has been consistently going down, down, down because people aren't driving right now. And so gas prices are almost as low as they were when I was in high school. That's quite a while ago. But we may not bring in that much from oil and gas taxes this year as we have in the past because of this. The value of oil has decreased pretty drastically because of the quarantine. Car taxes, so 20 cents per gallon that you're paying for gas is tax. So if gas is $1.20 a gallon, $1 is what you're paying for the gas. 20 cents of that is tax. So that goes towards the state, and sometimes will be reinvested in things like maintaining roads and stuff like that. And then when you buy a new vehicle or even a used vehicle, They'll tell you, you have to pay the tax title and license up front, and those fees go to the state as well. Now, here in Texas, because we are a conservative state, we have what are called sin taxes. These are levied on behaviors that we consider immoral or damaging, and so we tax them. And one of the arguments behind having these types of taxes is that it may discourage people from participating in these behaviors. So things like taxing liquor, beer, cigarettes, strip clubs, now vapes and CBD and all that kind of stuff. These are considered, if you, based on, traditional morality, Christian morality, these are considered immoral behaviors. Now, most of us don't agree with that, but the point being is in conservative states, there are these taxes, and all of that goes directly to the state. They're meant to kind of regulate these behaviors, discourage certain behaviors. That doesn't really turn out to be the case. I've never seen anybody turn down a beer because there was a tax on it. But this tax accounts for about 4.6 of our total revenue as a state. And then fees. We pay tons of fees. If you've ever looked at your cell phone bill, you'll see all these fees on there, or if you've ever stayed in a hotel or something like that. And a lot of those are local fees that are assessed by the state, the county, or the city, and they help add to that revenue pool. So things like the admission fees we pay to go to a state park or register a vehicle, or fees that are added onto our medical bills, court costs, all of that is added just to generate revenue. And then the big one, fines. You ever notice at the end of the month or the beginning of the month, the cops are out and they're pulling more people over than, they're pulling people over left and right. Well, as much as they'll tell you they don't have quotas, they do have quotas. I've known a lot of police officers in my life. And they essentially, the fees that we pay for tickets, parking tickets, all that kind of stuff, it's just another way for the state to generate revenue. And so in the last decade, about $3.4 billion has been raised for the state just in fines that are assessed for punishment. The problem with this system, though, is that most of the time, less than half of these fees will ever be collected. Some people just don't pay their tickets, or they get out of the ticket, or whatever it is. So it's not a reliable source of income. Some other revenue sources in the state. One of them that's kind of become controversial is the Economic Stabilization Fund, or if you ever hear about it, it's usually called the Rainy Day Fund. And it was created in 1988 after the recession to essentially, Texas would take additional revenue that they had left over at the end of the budget year and kind of put it in this rainy day fund for emergencies. As of about 2018, it was at $11 billion. And a lot of that comes from oil and gas profits on land that the state owns, all different kinds of sources. But the controversial part about this is that the state rarely will use this money. There have been times that back in the, around 2010, because of the 2008 recession, rather than tap the rainy day fund, the state was cutting the budget, laying off employees, underfunding programs, because their argument was that they didn't want to tap the budget because they didn't believe it was enough of an emergency. And then, if you remember, after Hurricane Harvey, rather than tap the rainy day fund for a literal rainy day, they instead waited for the federal government to give them emergency funds. And so rather than people getting assistance day one, they had to wait weeks for the federal money to come in. So our government has this rainy day fund, but they refuse to use it when the circumstances are, calling for it. And so this has upset the citizens of Texas quite a few times. The income tax we talked about, it's also what we call a progressive tax, meaning that as your income goes up, your tax burden goes up. But we only pay a federal income tax. Our state does not have the state income tax. 94% of Texans oppose having a state income tax, so we will probably never have one. But like we said, the problem there is that we then put a lot more burden on the property tax and the sales tax to make that money. Um, One of the kind of contradictory parts about Texas when it comes to this is that we demand a lot of our government. We demand a lot in government services, but Texans do not want to pay extra taxes to fund these things. So we want our kids to have a quality education. We want good roads, but we don't want to pay more taxes to get those things. So it's a bit of a contradiction, and the government just can't come up with this money out of nowhere. So this is something that's going to be a bigger deal here in Texas going forward. This fight over property taxes and capping them, we already aren't bringing enough revenue in. And so if we cap our property taxes, it could actually damage these programs and services that we demand of our government. Now, the areas that tend to consume the most of our tax revenue, transportation is one of them. Um, Sorry about that. Transportation is one of them. It's for people living in cities and things like that. Transportation is a big deal. We all live with traffic all of our lives, and now, one of our biggest complaints up here is toll roads. That every new road that's being built is a toll road. So we're already paying taxes to maintain our road system, but all new roads that are being built are toll roads, and so we're essentially double paying for our roads. The problem is Texas Department of Transportation says it needs about $5 billion a year just to maintain the roads that we already have. That's not building additional roads. So the main sources of funding for transportation are things like registration fees for our vehicles, federal highway funds, the sales tax on oil, and the fuel tax. So right now, we're barely bringing in enough revenue for transportation to maintain our roads, let alone build new ones, invest in railways, invest in other forms of public transportation. We don't have that here in Texas, and it doesn't seem outside of a few of the big cities, it's not much of a priority here in our state. Another one is energy production. This is one area where, not right now, but in a regular year, we do generate a lot of energy in our state, whether it's oil and gas, whether it is wind energy has become big in our state, surprisingly. And so there's been a lot of policy priorities about energy production and our resources. One of the controversies has been over water control. Who owns the water? Is it the state? Is it the citizens who own the property? We've seen a lot of controversy over this, especially because of fracking and groundwater being polluted by the practice of fracking. And so there's this debate over who these natural resources belong to. The state says it's in the best interest of the state's economy for the state to have control over these things. And sometimes, even if you own property, you don't necessarily own what are called the mineral rights to your property, meaning you don't have control of them. Texas is the largest consumer of electricity in the United States. But we also are one of the largest energy producing states as well. So a lot of our what we use for energy comes from our state itself. So what we're starting to see in Texas, surprisingly, is Texas has taken wind energy seriously. It's predicted to grow about 37% by 2030, so in the next 10 years. It's a bit ironic because it is growing in our state and it is producing a larger and larger percentage of our electricity and power. But Texas has a very confrontational relationship with renewable energy and has tried to take away subsidies and tax breaks and things like that from renewable energy producers. in favor of natural gas and oil because the state owns a stake in those industries. So, education, healthcare, transportation are three of the areas that we tend to spend the most money on. We talked about education a little bit, and we'll talk about it in the next chapter even more. Um, the third largest section, if you look at our graph here from 2017, the is other spending, and so that's really undefined, and we don't know where that money necessarily is going. But you can see what takes the most of our budget. This is the budget for 2017. You can see education takes 34% of our budget, so that is where the majority of the money is going. Healthcare. So, we don't have a government run healthcare program, but even though people, you can go to the ER and you have to be seen whether you have insurance or not. But those costs have to be made up for somewhere. And so a lot of times the burden of those healthcare costs is falling on the state. And so one of the arguments that's been thrown out there for, universal health care is that many states are paying for this health care anyway. And, the state is already paying for Medicaid, Medicare, and things like that. And so why not just expand that so the state could have more control of the costs and regulate the medical industry a bit better. But, here in Texas, we're not super in favor of that. But this just kind of gives you a picture of where most of our budget goes in a given year.